Hello, good morning. Thank you all for joining us today for the Anderson Lecture Series talk with David Hytone. My name is Beatrice Atenka, and I'm currently the John Muller Anderson Assistant Teaching Professor in the School of Visual Arts in Silver. And in this capacity, I coordinate the programming of the Anderson Lecture Series along with the events and award committee members. They have helped tremendously with this programming, so I would like to say thank you to them. This is also a wonderful space that has been helped and coordinated by Lauren Davis at the back. So I'd like to say thank you to Lauren. And I'll also like to say thank you to our interim director, Eduardo Navas, at the back as well. Thank you so much for helping us coordinate this lecture series. I'd like to give a little or a brief history about what this lecture series is all about. Dr. John Muller Anderson, Professor Emeritus, was an Evan Pugh Research Professor of Philosophy and the first director of Penn State's Institute of the Arts and Humanities. His passion for the philosophy of art and painting resulted in this generous gift from which we as a community have greatly benefited and are still benefiting. The John Muller Anderson Endowment in Visual Art was established in 2001 with the purpose of supporting outstanding programming such as this lecture series and related activities with guest artists that we bring to our campuses to interact with our students and community. All Anderson events are free, so next time you come around, please bring a +1. And it's also open to the public. At this point, I would like to read the biography of David Hytone, and then we can start or move forward with our lecture. David Hytone received his BFA in Fine Arts from the Minneapolis College of Art and Design after studying briefly at the Osaka University of Arts in Osaka, Japan. He has exhibited both nationally and internationally in solo and group exhibitions, including shows in Brussels and Ghent, Belgium, New York, Seattle, San Francisco, Minneapolis, Portland, and Des Moines in Iowa, where he was born back in the Paleolithic era. A recent visiting artist and lecturer at the J. Miller School of Architecture at the University of Indiana, he has worked in numerous private and corporate collections, including Microsoft, Facebook, Capital One, Swedish hospitals, Hilton, and the Permanent Collection of King County in Washington State. A 2024 McDowell Fellow and finalist for the 2018 Neddy Awards in Painting, Davis' work has been featured in many publications, including the Harper's, Lux, Seattle Met, and the final issue of Modern Painters magazine. Coincidence or causation? You should decide. He currently lives and works in Tacoma in Washington with his brilliant and heroically patient wife, Bridget, and their poorly behaved pug, Quincy. His next solo exhibition opens at Studio 23 in Belgium this November. David is clearly unafraid of tangents, parenthetical asides, and run-on sentences, but continues to be uncomfortable, referring to himself in the third person. Ladies and gentlemen, help me welcome David Hytone.
Thank you, Beatrice, not only for that lovely introduction, but for inviting me out here in the first place. So far, it's been fantastic, and I'm looking forward to more studio visits with the rest of the MFA candidates over the next couple of days. As I was joking to the MFA seminar yesterday, I think performing this lecture is the penance I have to pay for the privilege of being able to hang out with the students. Let me find out where I'm at this thing here. Oh, there it is. Hello. Slight correction. I think my bio was old. The show in Belgium was actually last November. My next show is at the Tacoma Art Museum this September. Let's see here. So before I get started, I should probably say that I'm going to be going through a lot of images at a fairly heavy clip. Um, but I'm assuming that all our brains have been fairly pickled by scrolling through social media for the last 10 years, so you'll be able to keep up and the dopamine hits will keep coming and everyone will be happy. Um, Beatrice let me know when we first started corresponding about this a little over a year ago that the ongoing theme of the lecture series this year was one of alchemy. And I thought that was a fairly apt framing device for my lecture. Webster's defines it as, and I quote, a medieval chemical science and speculative philosophy aiming to achieve the transmutation of base metals into gold, the discovery of a universal cure for disease, and the discovery of a means of indefinitely prolonging life. That seems like a bit of a high bar, so I'll stick with the secondary definition, which is a power process that changes or transforms something in a mysterious or impressive way. I'm not really comfortable with the impressive part, but the transformation part is something I can definitely associate myself with. A lot of things that are not evident when one looks at the work, especially if you're just viewing it in photographs, is that the work is constructed from hundreds of different separate pieces of paper. They often begin with an underlayment of offcuts and detritus from previous pieces. This helps inform the structure of the piece and also imbues them with an actual tangible connection to the past work. Most of what you see is comprised of a facade. They're comprised of specific interlocking shapes that are cut from these large sheets that I paint with generic patterns such as wood grain or stone or what have you, out of which, so I have a kind of a stockpile of material that I use that I cull the individual pieces from. They're built up fairly slowly, piece by piece. It's technically collage, but I don't like to really use that term as it has an association with pre-printed materials and photographs, and none of that is actually used in my work. So I tend to steer clear of it. Most of the elements that are brought in are, of my own kind of creation, but I often bring in elements from outside to provide some stylistic shifts, expanding the vocabulary of the piece and providing connections to history in art and design. But of course, I didn't always work this way. I didn't come out of the womb with a little X-Acto knife in my hand and a roll of tracing paper. When I graduated from Minneapolis College of Art and Design back in 1991, not quite the Paleolithic era, I actually was more of a sculptor. I painted a little bit. Painting was something that I did to have fun, and the sculpture was my serious work. But after I graduated and I had a couple of shows, they were both sculpture and installation, I started playing music. And then I started playing music more. And then pretty much for the next 20 years after that, I completely set my artistic practice aside and concentrated on playing music. I had nothing like a dedicated studio practice whatsoever. I'd paint occasionally. I'd set up a little easel in the basement or in a closet or what have you, but it really wasn't something that I was doing with any regularity. So 20 years goes by. I play a ton of gigs at questionable venues, and I paint about 7 paintings. And then eventually I moved from Minneapolis out to Seattle, Washington, 2009. And shortly after I arrived there, a new friend of mine came over to my apartment, and he saw these paintings that were on the wall that I wasn't, I just put them there because there was something to put there. But he was just joining a new co-op gallery in town and suggested that I might want to apply. I said, what the hell, I'll throw my hat in, and I did get in with the caveat that I would have to have a show in 5 months. So I had 7 paintings. I figured I could maybe squeeze out 7 more in 5 months. And I picked up pretty much the way that I left off, heavy impasto, on oil on canvas, non-objective abstraction. Um, and for the first year or so, it was just a dream to be painting again. I forgot how much I missed it, how much I forgot. I forgot how much I enjoyed the conversation with the paint, the pure improvisational nature of the way that I was working. Of course, things being as they are, nothing can stay lovely forever. And eventually that improvisational nature began to slowly kind of, what's the word I'm looking for? It just didn't give me the juice anymore. Things started to slowly shift. And it wasn't really a surprise because basically I was trying to paint in the same manner that I had 20 years ago. But I was a completely different person than I was 20 years ago. I couldn't fit into the jeans I wore 20 years ago. I don't know why I thought I could fit into the painting style of 20 years ago. So shifts began to occur slowly but surely. But it was a little hard because it is very seductive to work this way. And, um, you know, I think of this time in the studio as like this romantic notion of what people who don't paint think of as painters, with like jazz in the background and a glass of wine in my hand and a paintbrush in the other, and it's all just ugh, and it felt lovely and wonderful. But I began to distrust the idea. I was like, this is too much fun. This seems like there can't be any substance in something that I'm enjoying so much. So I began to make some changes. Things got pared down. Um, the fields of like frenetic activity that I once was producing kind of got coalesced into figures, and the pictorial space became flattened. I started to give the hint of a suggestion of a horizon line that gave a hint to something like gravity or physicality. Eventually, the medium I was using, the heavy impasto paint, became kind of a roadblock to moving forward. So I switched to working in uh, in ink and gouache for a brief period. And that was really productive. The work became tighter and it became less fascinated with, the materiality of the paint. It was more concerned with depiction. I further dug down, spent a lot of time in my sketchbook, kind of slowly creating a new language for myself. I'm not saying that this isn't referential to anything that ever came before it, but for me, it was the beginning of a new language and a new approach towards depiction, as opposed to kind of the amorphic abstraction that I'd been working with before. The problem was, so when I went back to starting to work in oil on canvas, it just didn't feel right. I just couldn't make a connection to what I was enjoyed in the work I was doing before with this method. It felt like an approximation, like I was describing something I wanted to make instead of actually making it. So it was around this time that a good friend of mine named Robert Hardgrave, who's a Seattle artist that I highly recommend you look up, he's a brilliant artist, and he gave me the suggestion of trying collage. And again, I knew what he was talking about. He just meant assembling the work as opposed to just merely painting it. And so I did. I jumped in. The first one I did was 6 feet by 9 feet. I don't know why. That's the scale I decided to start at. But immediately I felt a connection, and I felt something that was missing from the work I had been doing before. It was completely freeing. The language felt so fresh, and it started moving really quickly from there on. Everything was fairly pared down. The abstracted figures were kind of existing in this liminal space. It was just kind of hinted at by the raw Okawa paper. And pardon me, I'm train of thought, loss of sleep. The expressive hand that I had grown to despise is actually now replaced by a more mechanical and dry approach. Now, these were all made from as I mentioned, Okawara paper, which comes in these, well, it comes in many shapes. The kind I was using comes in big 3 foot by 6 foot sheets, which makes it really, um, it's great because then it's actually big enough to be an underlayment or a foundation for painting, but it also has one side's kind of smooth, one side's kind of pebbly, so you get different things that you can play with as far as texture goes. But most importantly, it's really tough. It holds up to a beating and cutting and ripping and tearing and lots of paint without breaking down. And there's a beautiful translucency to it as well. So it was something that like I stumbled into and I've been using as my, it's just been paint and this paper ever since. Um, anyway, moving on from that. So more drawing than painting is the way I was looking at these pieces. And I was beginning to establish this new language um, that I was investigating, this kind of cobbled together figures. Looking back, I can really see that like Al Held and Saul LeWitt were pretty big influences at this time. As I got the work and the language kind of underneath me, beginning to feel comfortable, things began to broaden out. I introduced a broader color palette and started to integrate the offcuts and the detritus from the work that I had mentioned earlier. That's where that really became part of the work and part of the way that they are constructed. At this time, a lot of it was still very improvisational. I didn't. Most of these were just created out of whole cloth on, we'll say, canvas, for lack of a better term, without any predetermined ideas. One of the things that I was becoming really interested in at this time was the idea of translation. A couple of my friends, Robert Hargrave being one of them, were working in toner transfer. You guys familiar with that? Kind of the Xerox toner transfer thing. Is this something that am I just getting blank eyes for no? Nobody knows what it means. Okay, it's basically where you can take a Xerox and you put matte medium on it, and it will transfer onto canvas or paper or whatever. So you can take photographs and things like that and build things in that manner. And it has a really lovely, flat, kind of distorted effect when it's done well. And I was really intrigued by what they were doing, but I didn't want to be like the third best toner transfer painter in Seattle. So I decided to take a different approach. And I thought about the work of Andy Warhol in his early fashion illustration. He had a method of basically drawing on a sheet of non-absorbent paper, and then he'd roll a piece of absorbent paper on top of it, and the image would come off, and it would be kind of distorted and blotted and lovely and very human. And so I kind of took that as a stepping off point. I switched out the non-absorbent paper for glass, and eventually I just kind of stumbled into what I would call my glass dry paint glass transfer technique. Pardon me, it's a mouthful for even me, and I've said it like 5,000 times. Basically what you do is I paint on a piece of glass, and while the paint is still wet, I'll etch into it, allow that to dry. Sometimes I'll come back over the top of those exposed areas, allow that to dry, and then take a sheet of paper, either raw or painted, make sure that's dry, and then adhere it to the top to the glass with matte medium, and then almost allow that to dry. And when you peel it off, you basically pull the image off the glass, transferring it off. So you get the reverse of what you painted. And here you can see some examples of some of the common applications of that. In that process, the what you do, the act of painting on glass is weird anyway. It's kind of imprecise and slippery. And I like the idea of my hand being compromised in that way. And the fact that the process of pulling it off the glass, you leave a lot of information behind. Not all the paint makes the transfer. And so there's lots of information in that process, which I also found very intriguing. I use this technique to make a lot of different elements, some like the kind of wallpaper type surfaces that I just showed, and other to make these kind of botanical abstracted foliage that would populate some of the crude nods to landscape that I was beginning to show. So that was, there you see it on the glass, and that is after it comes off the paper, and that's the cut product of all the little bits and bobs that came out of that in a very messy studio. I was really interested in kind of the artifice of this presentation, kind of the naked obviousness of the facade. Once they were applied, they, if you're standing in front of it, because of the nature of the paint so thick that any, there's no hiding the collage nature of it. And I really enjoyed the fact that this crude symbology was being presented in such a kind of obvious way without artifice. Eventually, the layering of the process, along with the glass plate transfer method, and the way that the products of the process were reused from piece to piece, going back and moving forward, began to suggest to me ideas of memory. Did I go? Boop? Nope. Okay. Thank you. I was also considering, ideas of identity, how identity plays in memory. And so basically, if experience is formed into memory, and memory is the foundation of what our identity is, then our identity becomes a lens through which memory is, or experience is forged into memory. Example being, if you happen to see your little brother drown at the beach. Okay, I didn't have to go this dark, but apparently it's dark time, so I went dark. That memory is going to change your identity, and that identity is going to change the way that you experience a beach or anything like that for the rest of your life. That's an extreme example, but it happens in minute ways all the time. This constant spinning Ouroboros of experience, memory, and identity. It changes this way you see yourself, it changes the way you see the world around you, and it's this constant evolution that I found really fascinating. So it's like this, as I said, ever-evolving Ouroboros, and it defines who we are, and it defines how we move forward in the world. And it's also a process that has kept millions of therapists well paid, just like mine back in Seattle, going back since the time of Sigmund Freud. Many of the techniques I was using at the time actually suggested this cycle, but what was interesting is sometimes it would actually show up in the tools I was using. Like take the brayers on the right here. They all started out the same way as a mostly clean brayer on the left. This is something that I would use to take the different pieces of paper and to kind of adhere them to the surface of the paintings. And I would also use them as paint buildup on them to create different types of textures in some of the paper and put kind of a field of light noise or grit, glitchiness over the top of the surface when the painting was done. And each time they got used, they picked up more paint. And that picking up of the paint created basically a new memory in the piece. And that new memory of the paint on the piece is what was then imparted the next time it was used. So each time it got used, it was changed by the memory of the last use. And they eventually got so thick and laden with paint, I had to have a friend build me some of those custom heavy handles just so they could fit, because they wouldn't fit on the standard ones they were purchased with anymore. Around this time, my compositions were becoming more and more complex, and theater and its second cousin, still life, became something that I would view the work through. The figures were starting to look like kind of abstracted performers to me, and the relationships between them and the environment became increasingly theatrical. I really leaned into the idea for a while, and much of the work at this time featured these kind of cobbled together performers on rudimentary stages, and I was even including, hints of proscenium curtains and, uh, you know, crude theater sets and props and actors and performers waiting in the wings. For some reason, this reminded me of the work of David Bohm, who's a physicist that a professor in college introduced me to. He was a bit of an outlier among his peers because he had a very spiritual way of looking at quantum physics. He had a theory called the holographic paradigm, which basically said not only is everything connected, but everything was actually everything. Everything contained everything. That what we walked through in the world was something he referred to as the explicit order, that tangible thing we could see. But it was actually something that kind of bubbled up from what he called the implicate order, or the hidden field of potentiality that the universe was actually made of. So a another way of looking at it is that things are kind of could basically, if you're looking at poetically, like the world is kind of just a massive potential except for where you look, and it's kind of popping in and out of existence just based on where our gaze fell. This is really tied to uh, there's my, okay. Sorry, my clicker wasn't working. Um, this work was really tied to the double slit experiment. People in the room know about that at all? Not a lot of physics fans in here. Um, basically, this goes back to this experiment. They're trying to figure out if particles act as a wave, or electrons acted as a wave or a particle. And they set up an experiment where they had a barrier with two slits in it, and they shot individual electrons at it. And the idea is if they were a particle, you just get two bands on a sheet of photographic on a photographic plate that was behind the barrier. And if they're a wave, you'd get this kind of interference pattern. So they shot the electrons on it, and they got two bands, and said, okay, that solves it. Matter is a particle, it's not a wave. Close the doors, go have lunch. The thing is, when they came back, they saw that there was an interference pattern. It was on the thing, on the photographic field, because essentially that when matter is not being observed, it behaves differently. So it would act as a wave when observed, or act as a particle when observed, but revert to a wave when not being observed. It kind of rendered, a poetic reading of this kind of renders the whole thing, the world around us, like a shifting theater set. I mean, it's kind of strange, shaky ground that we're standing on when you think about it that way, and you combine that with these theories that I have, memory and experience and identity. It's really no wonder that, we live in very confused times. We're kind of in this ever-shifting evolution, both inside and outside, and it's all facade that's being turned in and onto into itself over and over again, in a way that it seems almost impossible to penetrate. Keep hitting that button. There we go. This is probably a good time to admit that these ideas aren't necessarily what my work is actually about. These are just the ideas that come to me while I'm working on it. I don't really have any expectation that the viewer is going to be gleaning any of this nonsense from the work. I've always worked image first, and I have no say about how it's perceived once it leaves the studio, and that's something I've grown completely fine with. That said, be it implicit or explicit, these were the things that I was considering over the years, and bit by bit, it became a little more integrated into the work. And I found as the language I was using was becoming more and more specific, the imagery began to follow suit. Sometimes I think of painting on, well, really all artwork, on a spectrum from abstraction to representation, or put another way, from uh, from being an object to being a depiction. The more abstract it is, the less the average viewer has easily identifiable language they can attach to something in the work, the more it becomes an object, something wholly unto itself. The more it moves towards depiction, the more it picks up thematic baggage, the more it becomes both a portal and a vessel. Um, when we present an object, kind of a something, a recognizable object from the world, its mere nameability begins to wrap words around it. And it often, with those words, come associations, specific associations from the viewer that once again, I have no control of and can't possibly know. Um, much like with my horrific example of some child drowning earlier. I don't know why I made that up. Um, uh, a simple playground slide, which is one of the first things your eyes go to in this painting, could have any number of repercussions psychologically for the viewer, depending on what their childhood was like. Even a slight nod towards figuration can push an otherwise abstract object towards nameability and all the connotations that that carries. When presented together with abstraction, I believe that the representational object often carries more weight. The eye is drawn to it like visual clickbait. This kind of tethers us to the world and becomes more and more important in the work for me, and it was signaling a place where my work would be heading soon. Shortly after the pandemic, I started considering the idea of nostalgia, and this was something that to this day has been a foundational aspect of the work. Much like after the 2016 election, the COVID years found me returning to the comforting balm of supposed simpler times. I found myself binging old reruns of like The West Wing and Mary Tyler Moore. I mean, which wasn't even my nostalgia. It's like I was using secondhand nostalgia, or my nostalgia wasn't good enough. I had to borrow my parents' nostalgia to feel nostalgic enough. I realized at that time it was like this balm for the soul in the midst of the chaos that we were experiencing. But soon I realized it was also kind of a bludgeon of regressive thought and a normalization of societal injustices that were often kind of offhandedly handled in like, these sources of nostalgia from our youth. And for me, nostalgia was fairly easy to conjure. It's something as simple as just using this particular Prussian blue hue denotes a sense of nostalgia to me. How a simple abstract bouquet and a little country plaid can do a lot of heavy lifting in that regard. Part of the other interest in nostalgia for me was involved what I call aspirational imagery. I started employing these kind of idealized landscape in the work. And I became drawn to the seduction of travel illustrations from the 1940s and 50s, distilling, entire cultures down to some generic shorthand, like gondolas for Italy and the Eiffel Tower for France. I also was looking at something odd, which was Old McCall's sewing pattern illustration. Is anybody here old enough to remember this? Okay, I can see a few gray hairs raising their hands. I grew up with my mother, memories of my mother on our dining room table with these pinning sewing patterns to fabric, with this incredibly optimistic idea of the snappy clothes she'd be soon dressing her young boy in. And I did indeed wind up with a pair of red polyester pants, and the fabric was so thick and itchy that it gave me a rash every time I wore it. And yet somehow she never got me those snappy green boots, which really actually would have brought everything together. Um, after some time, I had amassed a stockpile of these McCall's patterns and the travel illustrations, and I then thought I could use elements of my own back catalog, kind of my own stockpile, so to speak, to assemble something together with a stockpile of images I had gleaned from the internet. Kind of, in a way, both elevating these nostalgic cast-offs from the past and taking the piss out of my own work and kind of not treating it with any kind of preciousness. Um, so I slowly started to work in this direction, and that image before this is a go back. That's a so that's the Photoshop mock-up that I did as a basis for this painting. Um, and this is where I first started, first phrase into appropriation of images, something else that would be carrying forward for me for quite a while. Um, it really opened up the way I was considered, how I was looking, and it was introducing ways, something that kept me really interested in the studio because, like, I didn't know how to paint like this, so I had to completely teach myself to paint in this more realistic manner. So the new challenge was something that was also really valuable at the time. As compositionally unwieldy as the final product was, it did help point the way towards a new direction and provide a roadmap for work I'd be making in the future. A lot of what followed suit followed those ideas. It's kind of returned to a spare figure ground relationship from the works in my past. I began paring back much of the defining aspects of my previous work. I dispelled the idea of defining these specific settings with theatrical language and began to allow the foundation of offcuts and scraps that I would normally carry or cover up kind of carry the weight of denoting the space. I even started creating my own aspirational images by taking photographs and then transferring them in a way through Photoshop and then painting them as if they were color-separated prints akin to the type that I'd find in the old travel illustration. The glass transfer work and that I'd used for years and years also began to fall away. I was beginning to use it less and less, along with a lot of the common practices that I had kind of leaned on, and all the elements that I associated with my own work that I developed as my voice over the years, I started slowly stripping away from my practice. Meanwhile, more realistically rendered objects were becoming more and more prevalent in the work. I was still interested in a lot of the same themes, still considering things like nostalgia, but I began to employ different visual touchstones to get to the heart of the matter, to work at it to different purposes. Without really knowing it at the time and not without putting any language to it, my investigations were turning inward. Then something magical happened. I broke my thumb, and it was my favorite thumb. It was the one I did all my thumb stuff with, and unfortunately, I had to sit with that brace on my hand for 6 weeks, and despite my attempts, that's just an attempt at humor, not even an attempt at painting, I couldn't do anything with it at all, and I mean anything. And there's a lot of things that you realize you really want your right hand for, but we don't need to get into those. And a couple of things happened over this time. I had 6 weeks. I was right in the middle of trying to finish up a large commission, and then I had a show that was looming on the horizon, but I couldn't do anything about it. I couldn't even work in my sketchbook. And one of the things that happened is I realized that I had to start kind of just composing paintings purely in my mind. And I realized how much my own hand had become kind of a dead weight, or the muscle memory of the way I make marks was something that I couldn't get away from, but just purely, conjuring up compositions in my mind was free from all the baggage of the way that I was used to making artwork. And that was something that was really, really, really interesting to me. And I wasn't exactly sure how to move forward with it, but I was definitely intrigued, and it was a respite from my restlessness of not being able to be productive. Unfortunately, when I got back after 6 weeks, when I could remove the brace and get back to the studio, I had to finish this commission that I was working on, which was still very much stuck in the work that I've been doing uh, from the past. This is one of the terrible things about doing commissions. They never want anything new. They always want something that looks like something you've already done. And you do it because you like to eat. Um, so I was forced to kind of put those notions behind, and had to finish up this commission, which was now well past its delivery date. And as soon as that was complete, I had about 3 months to complete a show that I hadn't had even started work for. So I was in a bit of a pickle, and it was hard for me to consider I'm going to rewrite the way that I make work now, with all these thoughts I had about like how I was visualizing the work, when I was sitting on a bunch of sketches and ideas from before my injury that I was planning on moving forward with. But against those odds, I kind of started out um, by looking backwards. I had done this quick painting for a show in Belgium the year before. It was a one-off piece. I had never done anything like it before or since. And it really just started out with just wanting to kind of bring a two-dimensional drawing manifest in 3 dimensions. A lot of people, when they saw this, thought that this secretly said "fuck Trump." It doesn't, but I like to think that all my work says "fuck Trump," um, in one way or the other, explicitly or not. Um, but I just enjoyed, this idea of kind of getting back to something that was a little more foundational. Um, so when I kind of brought this into this new work, I gave it a little bit more sense of dimension. And immediately I got this sense of that there was some sort of implied utility. And I started thinking that it really resembled almost like a crib or a bassinet. And and more at the time, the idea of sleeplessness started to nudge its way into my thoughts and into this particular body of work. After I produced a few more pieces, it was really underscored. I looked around the studio and I saw all these paintings were steeped in sleeplessness. And it hadn't been planned. It just sort of happened. By simply permitting myself a different framing advice, I could better see what the work was trying to tell me. Um, I've been a sufferer of severe insomnia ever since I was diagnosed with multiple sclerosis back in 2018. And I had originally planned this piece to be constructed in the same manner as that taking stock piece earlier, where it was a combination of images from the internet and my own back catalog. And it was constructed that way. But um, as I finished, got the piece closer to being finished, I could see somehow it reminded me of that notion or that sensation of nodding. Uh, you ever have that notion where you kind of nod off and you get that kind of vertigo and there's kind of a loud, almost cacophonous feeling? There's actually a word for it. It's hypnagogia, and it happens in all different kinds of forms. And for me, when I was a kid, I would wake up with an incredible sense of kind of like falling and almost like a loud orchestral chaotic crashing of music. It was like I was just shook awake into full a wakefulness. Um, and So this is not something I experience anymore, because one thing insomniacs don't do is they don't nod off. Um, but while I was in the midst of making this piece, something even more interesting happened. I was building up pretty much the same way that I always had. I start with these uh, drawings, these kind of basic drawings, and then I build more articulated elements based off of those and then paste them on the piece. So you get this kind of placeholder drawing on your left. Um, and then when it came time to affix this more rendered pulley over the top of the roughly drawn one, I kind of had this moment of pause because I was looking at them and I realized that they were both carrying the same weight. Like I really actually enjoyed the look of just the crudely drawn pulley and the fact that it had as much power and presence as a fully rendered object. Um, and it was that moment I decided that I was just going to actually present them together in a separate piece. The idea of it just kind of came to my mind. I was initially a little nervous uh, once I started and those concerns were made manifest when it was finished because it stood totally apart from anything else that would be going into the show, anything I had made up until that point. Over the years, I've always kind of, since I started regularly exhibiting, I would often present what I would call index pictures or index paintings side by side with the main body of work. A lot of them would do something like in the case of this, it's kind of bringing the underlayment that the paintings are built upon to the foreground, kind of to give what's the word I'm looking for, to expose the nature of their productivity or their production, um, and just to give a visual counterpoint and a different avenue for the viewer to find their way into the work. Um, Another thing that I found myself doing was I would just lift entire passages from paintings and then present them as separate paintings. This one uh, came from I took a picture, a detail shot of this piece in progress um, to post on Instagram. And once I did, I was like, hey, I really like how that looks on its own. So I actually painted like 3 versions of this and gave it an incredibly uninspired title. Another thing I would do is I would take individual elements from given pieces and present them separately from the painting side by side. An idea of like, does this kind of phantom limb, so to speak, carry any of the thematic weight from the original piece? Is it possible to have bring any of that information, any of that history, any of those themes with it? Or once divorced from its source material, does it truly become something wholly unto itself? Once again, these are just ideas that really have a lot to do, in my mind, with language and comprehension and memory. But the difference is that with this new piece, is that this didn't look like anything of any of those other explorations I had done before, because all those other explorations were using my language, my visual language in them, and what this one was was really didn't feel like my visual language at all. It felt like it could have been painted by practically anybody. And I think that's what actually attracted me to it in the first part. It felt freeing just to unshackle myself from some bullshit obligation to style or expectation. This isn't to say I was like utterly free from doubt. The next painting, which also came to my mind, just kind of fully formed, seemed to almost address those concerns directly. It's like I was reminding myself, if you paint it, it's yours. And to hell with any notion of what a David Hytone painting should look like. Palanquin followed suit, and I was still considering the framing device of sleeplessness and insomnia in the work, and this image of the medicine I take for my insomnia just popped into my head while I was working on that previous piece. And again, this bore no resemblance to my previous work. I mean, hell, it didn't even bear any resemblance to the work that I had just done, which didn't bear any resemblance to the work I had been doing. But I thought, I'm committed to this idea now. And I was really excited about like not having to concern myself so much with style. But I'll admit that the questions about, what makes up an artist's identity, about like who they are, who owns that, do I get to define that? Is that defined by the viewer? All these things are questions that knock around in my head to this day, as I was just, this was at the very beginning of a shift in work that I think I'm still, in the midst of right now. Well, with one foot in the past and one foot moving forward, basically, I joked that the exhibition looked as much like a group show as a solo exhibition once I got it up. And I had to consider about how I was going to move forward with my work. Even though the ties of the work I had done before, much of the visual language had developed over the years, had been jettisoned by the time, this show had gone up. I wasn't exactly sure where to move forward. So I kind of held on to the new ideas. And luckily, I had just gotten a fellowship to go to McDowell for a month. So I headed to New Hampshire. And the work started out exploring kind of, like I said, going, some of the new ideas I had been thinking about, particularly like these wooden structures. These were something that I was really intrigued with. And something that I knew that I was going to be playing with for some time. Plus, they're just a joy to build. And there's, sometimes a lot of my work involves delayed gratification. And it's nice when the work can, actually be truly joyful to make for me because of so much process that goes into my work. Sometimes it's not always like the fun comes at the end and not always in the middle. But it took a while for me to shake off my old habits. New ideas were presenting themselves, but at first it was hard for me to not fall back on old language. I mean, when you think about it, every ounce of any kind of, what's the word I'm looking for, success that I've experienced up to this point was all based on the work that I had made, on the voice I had established. And now I was considering just tossing that aside. And that is not something that is done casually. And so it just wasn't any easy prospect, even though I could tell it was an inevitability. I think part of me was still kind of very nervous and fighting it tooth and nail. While I was there, one of the things that kind of shook me loose from this is, oddly enough, I had a dream. I don't put a lot of stock in dreams. I'm not a dream guy. I'm not going to bore you with a description of my dream. But I'll give you a little shorthand one. In this dream, I had a rabbit, and for some reason, I loved this rabbit. And the rabbit got away from me, and it ran across the road, and it got hit by a car. And I went and I picked up the rabbit, which was then dead, and I was deeply sad. And it's probably no surprise that 4 months earlier, my dog had passed away. So, it's probably some of that was working its way into there too. But then all of a sudden, this dead rabbit kind of shifted in my hands and it scared the shit out of me. I woke up. Shortly after, I started looking, well, what are some of the symbols of a dead rabbit in different cultures? And culture after culture, it is a symbol of the natural end of a cycle, a symbol of rebirth, of letting something go to make room for something new. And it seemed all beyond apropos. It seemed terribly on the nose. But nonetheless, I decided to, take this rabbit and bring it into the work. And somehow at the time I was doing this strange organic gramophone bell came along with it. And I went back home to my home studio at the end of my residency, and I started working on a distillation of this piece. I thought there was going to be a whole series of rabbit paintings, and I realized after this one, it's no, you're done. It's almost like the rabbit had done its job, delivered its message to me, and it was no longer useful as an element that would teach me anything. But the gramophone bell, on the other hand, really got stuck in my craw. There's something about it that's both kind of optimistic and melancholy. It's this antiquated method of communication that stubbornly wanted to persist. It felt oddly personal. It felt a bit like my life as an artist in a way, just trying to be heard amongst the squalor of everyday contemporary society. I think as artists, we all just, we want to be heard. We're communicators. And we're communicators in a world where I think there might just be a little bit too much communication going on right now. With this constant bombardment of social media and where everything and everyone has a platform and yet nothing gets heard or said. We live our lives with our AirPods in and constant scroll in front of our eyes, and we no longer scream into the void, we scream into this wall of other screams that are coming from us from all sides. And yet we persist because it's what we do. I immediately had a lot of ideas where to take this series, and I have a lot of ideas that I'm going to move forward. But before I did that, there was something that was stuck in my craw that I wanted to get to first. I had been thinking about those wooden structures, and I wanted them to kind of see them in play with something from the real world. And for some reason, Rodin's Kiss got lodged in my head, and it kind of stuck there and nagged at me. Part of it, I think, was I understood the provenance of the piece, the fact that it started out as a little detail in the corner of the gates of hell, as a massive portal that Rodin created sometime in 1880. There you can see a little bit closer. You can see the outline of them there. For some reason, he pulled them from the figure from the archway because it seemed too romantic, too sensual, and he repurposed it. And now, through over 300 reproductions in both marble and bronze, it's become this universal symbol for the highest and purest form of romantic love, which is quite the journey from the gates of hell. Considering my own interest in recontextualizing imagery in my own work, it was no wonder that this image and that history would be interesting to me. But the funny part is the source image that I used for it actually wasn't even one of his sculptures. I took the source image from a photograph of a tchotchke little gift shop figurine of it, about 8 inches high. And it was so ridiculously proportioned. The thumb on the man's hand on her thigh was so disproportionate, it looked like he was holding a kielbasa or something worse. And so that had to be dealt with before I finished the painting. But all those considerations about provenance and translation were actually becoming secondary. In truth, the work was about something that was a lot more complicated and, to be honest, a lot more personal. And probably something I don't need to share in front of an audience of 47 complete strangers. Some things don't have to be explained, I suppose. You see, what I'd figured out is I thought that what was tripping me up in my work, and the thing that was causing me kind of to feel held back, was my own language that I had established. But in truth, one of the things that was probably doing it even more so was this 10,000-foot view I had of the thematic content of my work. I've been looking at everything through these lenses of like quantum physics and Irving Goffman and convoluted theories of experience and memory, but I hadn't really considered my own experience and my own memories, not just like abstract notions, but tangible reflections of my life and how I viewed the world around me. I've never really considered myself a expressive painter. It's not something I'm particularly comfortable with, but clearly I've been keeping myself at arm's length from my own work. My visual language kept getting more and more precise and more personal, but this 10,000-foot view of it was simply not up to the task anymore. So enter the shipwreck. Again, I was leaning into notions of nostalgia, but this time not as just some disconnected academic idea, but as something that I felt personally. Not the comforting balm of nostalgia, but more the part that normalizes tragedy and trauma. Uh, I realized that for the past 10 years, we've borne individually and collectively uh, just incredible burden after incredible burden. Politically, societally, if you've been paying attention to the news at all over the past 10 years, you're likely dealing with some level of depression or anxiety. And yet it never really gets talked about. We can argue back and forth about all the causes, um, and by we, I mean I. I don't address the effect of carrying the weight of all this with me nearly enough. Um, and personally, I've been operating with some level of depression ever since Trump first went down that golden escalator in 2015 to announce his presidency. It's not like I'm never happy. I'm quite happy all the time. I'm fucking happy right now. But deep down, there's a little darkness in my heart that has been there for quite some time. Not to mention, oh, that's right. Remember, there was a pandemic. This is another thing I find amazing. We're only a few years past this thing that killed 20 million people, this thing that some of us lost loved ones. We went through periods of separations, incredible anxiety, fear, wiping down our goddamn groceries, um, really living in absolute uncertainty for so long. Um, you know, the hope in it when it started, I was thinking, well, maybe at least, this is the kind of thing that brings society together. But no, it didn't do that. It just drove more separation and more schisms between us. Um, and the thing is it just, I was, I'll fully admit, like the first 4 or 5 months of COVID, I was terrified. Um, and it had, different implications for everyone. Most of the students in this room, your entire educations and world were completely upended in a way that is going to affect generations. Um, so, you know, and we all just kind of walk around with all this knowledge of this kind of collective trauma and as if it never happened, as if the effect of this prolonged, emotional weight around our neck would just magically disappear on its own. And it's not really any wonder. Half our country is shamelessly anti-intellectual, cultishly nationalistic, selfish as hell, Bibles and bootstraps. And the worst part is it feels so normal that this kind of burying of all these, of everything that we went through seems so everyday. Um, it's really what, these last series paintings are about, the ones last four I've shown you is, it's kind of like me telling my depression that I see you. Um, and there's a power in that. And, but I see other things as well. And that's a good thing because addressing and finding a way to come down from that 10,000-foot view and look at things more personally and take ownership of those things and maybe coming face to face with some things that I didn't want to face about myself through the work is what allowed me to make things like this, to just paint some big, dumb, absurd thing because painting a dumb, absurd thing just popped into my head. To have fun just playing with composition and the glorious pleasure of just making something with your hands. Not having any idea whatsoever what it means, and really being utterly fine the prospect that there's no meaning behind it whatsoever. That I can take a thing, even if it's just a dumb inverted house plant and a big dumb lobster, because it makes me happy. And to shamelessly circle back to the beginning of my lecture, maybe that's where the gold in uh, the alchemical process comes from. I mean, at the end of the day, if there's anything I've discussed today that rises to the definition of alchemy, it's probably that. And scene.
Thank you so much, David, for showing us process, which I really loved because it's rare, and also speaking about the different changes and moving from different media. At this point, I would like to invite the room for questions. If you have questions, kindly raise your hand and I will bring the microphone right next to you. I know we have questions.
Was I so thorough that I simply have rendered it completely and utterly clear.
Hi, I know you showed us some process photos, but some of the work from like the 2010s you were showing, just like the final result still just like baffled me. Like I cannot imagine how that comes together. I was just wondering if there's any like video or like a more thorough
Um,
description. I'm just really interested in how
there is
that
actually,
process works.
there's a couple of videos. I don't know exactly where you could find them online. When I did, there's that big piece, it was the 18 foot, is called, um, and the palindrome found its reflection. And it's one where I kind of went through all the long horizontal piece and I went through all the stages of it. There's actually a video about the making of that piece that Hilton um, produced for the show. It was basically for a new hotel that they were building around me as I was working on the piece in situ. And so they did a little documentary about that. And there is another one available. There's an award in Seattle called the Nettie Award, and I was a finalist for that in 2018. And they produced a little video that if you thought this lecture was a word salad, you should hear that. But it does show a lot more of my process as well. Is there particular parts of it that were uh, intriguing or you want clarification about?
What is that like Okawara material?
It's like I said, it's a Japanese mulberry paper. My favorite brand, they stopped making. Unfortunately, the factory shut down, so I'm using a kind of a lesser, less sturdy version of it. But it's machine made, made of mulberry paper, and one side has kind of a nice tooth to it, and the other side is glassy smooth. So depending on what you want to do, you can use either side. But mostly, it really just it takes a lot of paint and a lot of moisture without a terrible amount of buckling. It cuts really well, and yet it's flexible enough that it can kind of be manipulated easier. It doesn't get folded or buckled like thicker paper. Yeah, it is they make it in little sheets too. If you just want to give try a hand at it, they come in little, normal size sheets as well. But I think the big ones are now like maybe $20 for a sheet that big, which isn't that bad. And I go through, yeah, hundreds of them a year probably.
Hi, I really appreciated your talk. And I didn't realize at first that they were like layered paper,
Mm-hmm.
your images. And I was just wondering if anyone has or if you've taken up the notion of the palimpsest, this idea that of these layered meanings that they're kind of like this, like where things are inscribed and then erased, and there's just this kind of layered history of sort of past, present, and future. And it just kind of occurred to me that it sort of had this, especially when you started talking about like identity and memory and that it just really resonated in that way of the palimpsest, like PIALIMPSEST.
It sounds like I've heard the word before, but it is kind of new information for me, but it sounds fascinating. Um, the idea of the marking and the obfuscation and the covering, um, and the nice thing about that paper, especially when it's unpainted, is it's translucent, so you can see activity from behind. Um, One of the things I really like about some of the things that I do or I recognize in the work is that there's this kind of this artifice of like I'll intentionally leave seams and things open. I don't want to hide the process that it's constructed. I want it to be naked and bare, how these things are made. But sometimes in order to do that, I'm actually fabricating something to add to it to kind of point in the direction of, hey, I made this thing this way. And it's complete artifice. It's complete theater, pretending to be like a casual spill of paint when it's actually something that I make over here and then paste onto the piece. So I don't know if that's related whatsoever, but what you said kind of brought that to mind.
Your process really speaks to that in that it's intentional, and there are things that you choose to expose and others that you're covering up. And so the story is kind of underneath all these layers of painting and covering up that I just find really interesting.
Thank you. Yeah, I mean, and it's funny because that's part of the things. I can't say that I'm abandoning it or I'm never going to work that way again, but lately in the studio, I've been painting like those little figurines and they're just, just of my own imagination. And I just have to, I just imagine it, paint it. But there's no collage, there's no layering. I'm just painting like, uh, in a manner that I hadn't. For years, I wouldn't allow myself to do something like that because I couldn't build it out of collage. So it's like I had this rule that everything has to be, collage and cut and formed this way. And then, that thinking held me back for so long. It kept me from, ideas that would pop into my mind. So, well, I can't do that. That doesn't fit within the David Hytone way or some bullshit like that. And so, kicking my free of that of those hobbles was really important. And I know that that work that I did is still there and it still means something. And I also know that I'm not done with that yet, but for now, I'm kind of giving myself a rest. I think working the way I am now and stripping all that away is a way of building new language for myself and a new way uh, of basically I want new language so it will generate new ideas, especially now that I know that I can use my own experience in a much more personal way. And I think once I get that, much like when I kind of stopped oil painting and I started doing the collage in the first place, once I kind of establish that, then I can reintroduce those ideas of layering because I do truly enjoy that work and the flexibility that it gives me, and the final product of it is really something that, like, I know there's still juice to squeeze out of that fruit.
Yeah, I have a question here. Thank you for the talk, very insightful. I was wondering, you discussed early on how you had this musical practice you would play. It seems that after that, you never mentioned it back. Is there any influence, traces of that period of your life?
Absolutely. Actually, this came up in the seminar yesterday. Um, Particularly when I started out, I because mainly might have been because I was not that removed from the time when I was playing music. And I still do occasionally play music, but I don't do it in anywhere as often or at any professional level anymore. But I often, particularly in the early paintings when it was purely abstract, but really when I'm any kind of compositional considerations, I think in terms of rhythm and harmony and discord. I think in musical terminology when I look at the work, and I think of things as acting as, different elements acting as together as a chord that presents something. I think of counterpoint when I think of, something balancing something in composition, or if something is feeling too pretty that it needs, the discordant note. So it's definitely something that a way that I look at the work and have for quite some time, and it's also the titles that I come up with are kind of where the old songwriter that I was went to die. It's the last vestiges of my writing skills, or for
So
what they were.
in that regard, I do think it's interesting that it does seem like multiple sounds flowing visually, right? At the early pieces. And I also noticed that I don't know if you really alluded to this, but forgive me. I mean, I paid attention to everything you said, but if you could elaborate on the strip down that started to happen, because you started with that, and now that you explained this, the compositions were very elaborate, and your allusion to music, especially if you have a band or a big orchestra, right? You have so many layers of sound. I can see that analogy in the visual elements early on. Later on, you really have very minimal pieces, particularly ones with the rabbit. And I'm wondering how did you think about how you were including less elements in the composition and what that meant for you?
Oh, absolutely. It was very, I've always been, my proclivities is to be a maximalist, and I've always been a more is more kind of person. Um, it's I've always been fascinated by paintings that I see that seem to keep giving something. Every repeated viewings seem to expand your knowledge of the work. Um, but I think that when I sometimes it seems like this kind of breathing thing is every time I'm going to a shift, I pare everything down so I can concentrate on the one thing, on the main idea, and then that main idea can bring its friends along and it can regenerate maybe a more active space. Um, the work I'm doing now is so isolated, and to me, it needs to be to match, you know, the thrust of the work, which really all comes from dealing with, the long-term effects of feeling isolated within this lack of a better word, society that we're living in right now. Um, I'm truly, it's something that I don't want to make political work, um, but I have no problem making work that how politics makes me feel and what it's done to my soul, my heart. I mean, I shouldn't have to be angry so many times during the day just because I opened my phone and looked at the news. I mean, I would really like to go back to a time when like I could just be angry because I did something stupid and I could control that instead of this world spinning around me. Because it does, like anger dealt with often becomes depression. I go to therapy and I had to come to grips with the fact that, despite the fact that I'm a pretty lighthearted guy, I carry around kind of a low baseline of depression, and a lot of it has to do with how I'm interacting with the world and my view of it, and the helplessness that's so easy to feel. So, those are thoughts that lend themselves to isolated objects. I can't wait to be able to paint something else. To be honest, I'm enjoying it right now, but I'm waiting for a lighter heart within me to produce something else, like more lobsters and houseplants.
You spoke to delayed gratification early on, especially with your process being so complex, like there being so many parts to your process and the waiting time in between that. And I'm kind of just linking the things that you've said. I feel like a lot of us can resonate with that. I feel like in my own process, I have so many different parts, and I feel like it's a distraction from this feeling that I have inside that I'm trying to express and say. And so I do feel that delayed gratification when I finally see the finished project. I'm like, oh hell yeah, that's bitching. But then, as I saw your other works, do you feel like that delayed gratification is starting to dissipate a little bit? And as you get into this confrontation of your feelings and exactly what you're trying to say or what's coming, the simplicity of these, do you feel that gratification coming quicker?
Actually, you would think so, except I am really, and I'm not taking the piss out of myself. I'm really not good at that kind of painting. I can do it. It takes me fucking forever. Like something that some Atelier's trained kid could do like in an afternoon, in their studio. It takes me like 3 days to paint one of those little figurines because I don't have the skills. I'm learning them as I go. I don't have the mental plasticity to like pick up on stuff very quick. So there's still very much a delayed gratification when I sit down to do one of those. And the nice thing is it's offset because I am doing something new, and that's I mean the opportunity to learn new techniques after so much time and to be able to and for those to be so integral to the work you're making is a real gift. So I mean there's still delayed gratification for sure.
Thank you so much, David. We are so honored to have you and hear your talk. Thank you, everybody, for coming.
Thank you.
Yes.
Appreciate it. Looking forward to seeing some of you in your studios over the next few days.